which minis are better, 3D printed minis or the standard store-bought minis from the big boys like Games Workshop, Reaper, WizKids, and so on. In this video, we're going to try and figure that out as honestly and as fairly as possible. Let's get into it. Hi there, I'm Danny, the 3D Printing DM, and welcome to 3D Printed Tabletop, a channel where we cover all things 3D printing for your tabletop games. So, you saw the title, which minis are better? Well, first, let's establish some criteria. Today's selections will be judged based on detail, paintability, availability and convenience, variety, and price. Very nice. I'll be using 3D prints from many different designers and companies, not just our own, but I'm using what I've got printed. There's so many options to print that I had to narrow it down to something. 3D printing is always going to start with negative points. In D&D terms, 3D printing will always be rolling with disadvantage. And here's why. 3D printers cost a lot of money up front. There's always a risk of print failures, and 3D printing ends up being a hobby in itself. Trust me, I run a channel on it. And not to mention, finding models that you like or need that often have trademarked names and designs, it can be hard and take time. Oh, one last thing. The minis you'll be seeing are from all 4 years of my collection. This means you're gonna see some of the first 3D prints and some of my first paint jobs standing proudly side by side with professional paint jobs from our previous Kickstarters and in general, as well as models from my army of gray that haven't even been primed yet. Although it's really hard to do in some cases, we're gonna try not to let the paint job affect our ranking and are going to do our best to separate the paint job from the overall paintability of the models. Let's begin. Let's start with these Cobalts. There's obviously a scale difference. If you're playing D&D, these are definitely scaled to 25mm, which is what WizKids and generally Reaper scale their models to. We scaled to 32mm because we can. It's 3D printed, it's more paintable. You can have a little bit more detail, it's easier to work with. Miniatures like Cobalts, creatures like Cobalts, they are bulk minis, like Zerg minis. You have a lot of them. And these come in packs of 3, and they're a lot more affordable than some of the other models we'll be talking about. Now that being said, there's way more choices with 3D printing. It's easier to get a nice variety for your horde monsters because of that. The other thing you might say, oh, well, you can scale your 3D prints up or down, and you can, but if you are a sucker for pre-supports, they don't always work when you scale them down. 3D printing has paintability and availability of choices. But due to price and scale shortcoming of 3D printing, I'm gonna call this a tie. Now, Goblins are pretty similar in many ways to the Cobalts, but there's a big difference. Goblins are universal. They are used in pretty much every tabletop game, so the amount of variety is like double or triple the Cobalts. Because they're used in such a variety of games, you're gonna get so many different types of proportions, so many different types of scales. Like you can see, ours are bigger. Ours are basically like dwarf sized, and that's why I like them. We can add character and things that you're not gonna get from the WizKids models. But these are some of the first models I painted up, and I love them. My players love them, even though I can't have much detail with them, even as a beginner. So, because of the overwhelming amount of choices and proportions, I still think 3D printing wins here. So here we have WizKids Bugbear, Reaper Bugbear, and some 3D printed Bugbears. These are Bugbears from Lost Adventures Volume 1. Now you notice there's a wide variety in styles, right? What Bugbears look like very significantly. And if you go online and you look up like 3D printed Bugbears, it's even wider. I do want to say one thing. This is the Reaper Bugbear, and if you look at older Bugbears that are also made by Reaper versus like this more current model from their black range, I feel like they're better. I feel like they're nicer. They have more detail, they're more paintable, easier to work with in my experience. And I think there's something to be said about that. A company like Games Workshop has, over time, they have different types of materials that are both wonderful and terrible, like Finecast. I still think though, with these bigger medium-sized monsters, this is pretty much where 3D printing shines as well. This one's printed in FDM, and I think he looks really good, all things considered. And this is really possible because the bigger the model, the bigger the detail, and the easier it is to print even in printer type that isn't meant for this kind of detail. Because bugbears in particular are a staple of early level D&D, it's one of those models that I think people really want. Because of the larger selection and variety, especially in terms of like proportions and style, I think 3D printing still wins here. Moving on to the ghosts. These are Reaper ghosts, and these are 3D printed ghosts. This one's from Duncan Shadaluka, and this one is from one of our Lost Adventures, Volume 1. You can tell immediately there's a difference in finish. These look really cool in my opinion. I love that there's like variations, and it goes really well with the models, even completely unpainted. Very appropriate for something like ghosts. 3D printing can get something similar by printing in a tinted transparent resin, like any cubic green, like this orc for example. But to be honest, printing in that type of resin, it's not very convenient. These resins tend to be more brittle, and if all you want is some ghosts, then this is actually a really good option, especially for pricing. You're gonna see that buying ghosts is something that you can buy in bulk, so the pricing is good, the finish out of the box is good. The fact that there's so many varieties also makes this really nice, because again, almost every wargame and RPG mini company makes ghosts of some form. And yeah, there's a lot of 3D printed versions too, but I still think store-bought wins here. Get ready, people. The Intellect of Hour. This is a WizKids special. This is my first 3D printed model and painted model, but these are both Intellect of Hours. Yes, there's a price difference, there's a quality difference, and there's a big variety difference. There's no question to me, 3D printing absolutely wins here. Absolutely. Sorry, WizKids.
It's so sad.
I know, dude. Trolls. This is a WizKids troll, and this is a printed troll from Lost Adventures Volume 1. This is a perfect example, in my opinion, of where both types of minis can live in harmony and supplement each other. They're very different styles, as you can see, and I don't think that's a bad thing here, because trolls in particular, they're one of those things that are so ingrained in nerd culture. We have World of Warcraft trolls, we have D&D trolls, we have Pathfinder trolls, Rockgut Trogoths, which are trolls, but Games Workshop wanting a trademarkable name. And actually, I want to add also trolls. And obviously, bigger, different poses. And price is pretty similar after buying the STLs. So, I think this is a tie. Owlbears. This is a WizKids owlbear, and this is a printed owlbear, and it's from Lost Adventures Volume 1. Here, we have another staple of the D&D world, the owlbear. Now, on the surface, these models, they feel pretty similar to me in terms of detail, availability, and price. Both are very paintable. But where 3D printing jumps ahead, in my opinion, is the incredible amount of variety. Now, even though there's some really cool store-bought owlbears like this chonky dude, absolutely my favorite, they just can't compete with the crazy amount of owlbears that are available in the 3D printing market. Which, considering they are like one of those monsters that you generally don't have a lot of, it's surprising to me that there's such a variety of styles and interpretations of this monster. Not to mention this owlbear with the last gun. Oh yes, this goes to 3D printing. So while editing this video, I realized it's been so long since I printed this model, I don't even have the source anymore. I have no way of determining the actual cost for it. So we're gonna use these Artisan Guild Crusaders as a close enough model to best represent the cost for this specific section. Now we are moving to a Stormcast Eternal Proxy. This is one of the first guys I printed years ago when I first got a resin printer, just because I wanted to test the limits of it. I don't remember the source, and of course this is a Games Workshop model from one of my Underworlds warbands. The scale is obviously different, which is nice for people who want to use like similar proxies. Like I probably printed them at that scale to use for D&D. But if you're playing a war game, base matters and scale matters, especially if you want it to look similar to the other models in the game. That can be a problem because of the scale issues I talked about earlier, and because you might print a model thinking it's to scale and it's not, so you have to print another one, and that's kind of a pain. Now I will say, obviously, price for 3D printing is much better, but 3D printing gets points deducted because of availability and variety. Yes, there are a bunch of proxies for GW models, but the people you're playing with have to be cool with proxies in the first place, and your model will probably look inspired by, unlike many of the creatures for games like D&D. Now, the other thing I do want to say is that the 3D printed model quality is also very dependent on the sculpt itself, and that is a very high bar for miniature quality and detail for Games Workshop models, in my opinion. And a lot of proxies, they just won't meet the same standard. And because of this, store-bought wins this one. We're moving on to huge models, our Treants. This is a WizKids Treant, and this is a Treant from Lost Adventures Volume 2. There's also a lot of cool Treants in the market. Luke, Geek Gaming Scenics, did a video on his Treant from Loot Studios and how much he loved it, just as an example. But I do want to say, these huge models, in my opinion, I think they're really good. I think they're great. Like the level of detail, very good prices for the size, in my opinion, and more paintable. There are surprisingly barely any Treant choices on the market though, which means if you are not comfortable with this kind of tall, twiggy kind of look that a lot of Treants or Ents have, there's not going to be very many options for store-bought minis. Once again, 3D printing wins for sure here, due not only at price and cost, but availability, choices. Again, I think this is a clear winner this time. Alright, we are moving on to another huge model. This is a WizKids TRex, and this is a 3D printed one from our previous Kickstarter, Uncharted Lands. And obviously this one has horns, so I guess it's a different variant of T-Rex. And yeah, this one has a howdah with a broken pole, but this is the only T-Rex variant I had, so we're gonna roll with it. Once again, I don't have this gap filled, but I think WizKids shines. Again, bigger model, great detail in my opinion. All the scratches and everything, it just comes through really well. And very paintable, especially with something like a contrast paint or washes. So very beginner friendly. Price is pretty similar. After buying an STL and printing it, it probably ends up coming pretty close. These are models that aren't like Goblins or Bandits. You'll want a lot of Goblins, Bandits, Cobalts, but how many T-Rexes are you gonna run in an adventure? And sure, there's definitely more variety and options with 3D printing, but honestly, you could probably even use a toy and just stick it on a base, fill the gaps, and maybe do a repaint. It's probably gonna be as nice as one of these things, honestly. And I really mean that. There are some really cool, affordable T-Rexes online, and I guarantee your players are gonna love it anyways. So in the case of the T-Rex and probably any dire animal, I would say, I'm gonna call this one a tie. We are going to move on to the dragons. This is the moment we've all been waiting for, the gargantuan dragon. Now this is Ancient Green Guardian from Lost Adventures Volume 2. Now I'm gonna bring his WizKids version. The adult green dragon. This was so big that I felt the need to have it in the box. I needed to show this on camera.
They look like they're about to fight.
Yeah, I know. They are about to fight. This guy's pissed because this guy's got bigger wings. This is our biggest green dragonish model, the Ancient Green Guardian. And when you look at this thing in slicers, everyone says, damn dude, that's huge. And it really is when you think about printing this on even bigger printers. But you know, compared to this one, especially with those wings like this, it's like its baby brother. You know, in terms of scale, this is actually an adult dragon, which for those of you who don't play D&D, adult, this is like the middle-aged dragon, which means there's supposed to be an even bigger green dragon than this. Here's the thing. In game rules, this thing is supposed to take as much space on the board as this. That means this dragon is supposed to fit on this. Ridiculous. And they solve it by putting this little line right here. And that's them saying, oh, that's what this counts as. All right, back to the comparison. Price is the biggest difference here. $70. It's a lot to swallow. You know, it's pretty clear why this thing is huge. The paint job is pretty good in my opinion. And, you know, it looks pretty good. I could see why a lot of people would want to buy this, especially if they aren't interested in 3D printing huge things, or they don't have a huge resin printer, or the FDM that they want. This is giving them the quality that they want. There's a lot of cuts and things that are annoying and difficult that a lot of people don't like me. I don't like putting wings together, and you need a much bigger printer if you want to print these things whole. Even a mid-sized printer like the Saturn or the Sonic Mighty, they are still not big enough to print a lot of these things in one. You know, normally for smaller, more reasonable epic miniatures, I think 3D printing would win, but I'm actually going to call this a tie, and mostly because of price. There's a significant difference here, and it's obviously a lot more significant than $5 or $10, even buying STLs for these. But I think there is a justifiable reason for folks who really love kind of how epic this model feels compared to some of the other bigger models, or people who just want to collect them. It's definitely a premium store-bought product in my opinion, even for folks who use 3D printing. I do want to add a few more points. Availability might be more or less of a problem for some people more than others. And here's what I mean. If you're in a town or a city that doesn't have many local game stores, or that isn't big on the games you want to play, it's a much bigger factor. The same can be said if you maybe live in a country where purchasing or importing the models you want is even more cost prohibitive than what I showed here in this video. Also, there are a lot of companies that make models that are much higher detail, that have a lot more details packed in. Some people might like painting those models. There are models that are realistic. There's all different types of styles of miniature in both categories, right? And I stuck to the more affordable groups of miniatures because that's how I started, and that's kind of how I've continued, with exception of maybe the more expensive stuff like Games Workshop models. I think that's important to mention too. So this is a good point to hear what you think. Do you agree or disagree with some of these winners and losers? Or was there other sets of minis that maybe you'd have liked to see in this video that you thought might be a fair comparison? I'd really love to hear what you have to say, so be sure to leave a comment below. If you're interested though in purchasing any of the models I showed in this video today, I've included links to these in the description below. And if you enjoyed some of our models that I've shown today, you can purchase late pledges in the description below as well. It's the best way to support the channel if you like what we do here. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time. As always, happy printing and happy gaming.